wasn't the LPs that gave my daughter medicine. It was the MMAR people that stepped up and made made sure that my little girl had the medicine she needed, even though they knew I had to break the law. It's about compassion. It's about care. It's about having a little bit of empathy for our fellow human being that's ill and dying. If that makes you a criminal, then we're all fucking criminals, and I'm happy to be one.
I am.
If that
I'll
makes
stand by
sense.
your side any day of the week. I'm so happy to have had you make an impact on who I am. Seriously, thank you very much. So we're in front of City of Toronto City Hall today at the Board of Health meeting, intent on reviewing the City Health Commissioner's report with regards to cannabis storefronts. It was specific to recreational use of cannabis, which is interesting given that medical cannabis has been legally accessible for patients in Canada for the last 15 years. So one would hope that that would be at the forefront of the conversation, but it hasn't as of yet. So we're hoping we can do that today to make sure that patients are protected in this conversation.
Risky breathing. Chest compressions for a poisoning, a drug overdose. That's murder. Out and out murder. There's a deputation under my Twitter to the Board of Health. Basic first aid knowledge. You got a breathing problem, give them air, not chest compressions, right?
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. Glen Smith, Ward 2, campaigning on supporting the dispensaries. The current laws are unconstitutional in Canada. We're also putting together a project called the Beautification of Rexdale project, which we've already begun trying to find some of the beautiful parts of Rexdale and Toronto, and kind of like seeking the good in Toronto. I don't know if anybody's familiar. Just down the street at Queen and Sherbourne, there was hot dogs for the homeless this past Saturday. Just a genuine act of kindness, and that's what Toronto is really about. Toronto the good. Toronto the good isn't about local city hall raiding small little businesses in Kensington Market, the pot dispensaries. There were a lot of ways of getting around that, I think, but that's the course that City Council chose, so that's why we've got a protest today. Why am I here today? Because I'm a patient, so I smoke marijuana for medical, and I'm actually a customer of many different dispensaries in Toronto because I kind of like to shop around. It's fun, you know. It's a great way to get your medicine. Dealing with the licensed producers, to be really honest, it can be very, very difficult. There can be a paperwork trail, an email trail, and 10 days later, you're looking for your medicine. And that's not how we work in Canada. The health system in Canada is if my prescription is filled by a doctor, I go somewhere almost immediately. And that's the benefits that the dispensaries were providing for people. And that's what the city decided to raid, or I guess Toronto City Police. But the laws are unconstitutional. Charter 7 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedom is currently under review. The federal government of Canada has until August to change the law because the current law is unconstitutional. And there's a lot of Supreme Court cases to back that up. My name is Glen Smith.
The last person I helped was an elderly woman who needed a THC-infused topical for her arthritic pain. About 20 minutes later, Project Claudia came in, and I was charged with possession of marijuana for the purpose of trafficking. Not sure why, because I was just giving her some medication that's non-psychoactive, it's just topical, and it helps with pain, fibro pain, arthritic pain. And this is something they wanted to use as opposed to using NSAIDs or opiates or other different types of pharmaceuticals. She was also an MMPR recipient as well, but her licensed producer does not create these products, and they're not allowed to by law. So she came to us. So she's not allowed to do that anymore. And if these charges do stick, I guess my future's pretty much over.
How will you fight the charge, though?
I have some legal representation, that's all I can say right now, through the organization I was working for. I'm just hoping for the best. That's
Have
all.
you been given a court date?
Yes, I have July 29th, I think, but I also have to go in to be fingerprinted, registered as a criminal, things like that.
Have you been arrested before?
No, I've absolutely not. This was a real shock to me. Well, I think Project Claudia was unnecessary. It was heavy-handed. There's other ways they could have done it.
Such as?
You know what? I'm not the authority on that, but I think that busting down doors and arresting frontline workers and things like that probably wasn't the best method. Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Name is Katie, K-A-T-E-Y. Last name is Asaph, A-S-A-P-H. What happened to you, Katie?
I actually wasn't on premises at the time the raid Project Claudia began. I was simply stepping foot into the residence, which is actually a separate entrance from the dispensary that I am an employee of, Eden Medicinal. As I was stepping into the residence, I was greeted on the other side of the door by a detective already in the residence at the time, brought into the store, placed in handcuffs, along with the other employees who were detained at that time.
Have you been charged?
Yes, I have been charged with 3 counts.
Of?
Possession of marijuana with the intent of trafficking, possession of hashish with the intent of trafficking, and possession of criminal proceeds.
And you say you weren't even in the store at the time?
I wasn't even in the store at the time, no.
Are you an employee of the store or you're just a
Yes,
customer?
I am an employee of Eden Medicinal.
How do you feel about
I feel like it was unnecessary. I feel like there was other ways that the government could have gone about this, that the police force could have gone about this. There are now dozens of young people who are going to be fighting these charges and potentially impacted for the rest of their lives. Again, I mean, I am not a regulating body. I cannot decide. But the raids were unnecessary, and there is, again, regulation to be brought forward for this.
Legal medical marijuana patient in this country, but I choose to use local dispensaries because accessing medical marijuana is incredibly difficult. You're making medical access not accessible to people who actually need it. I used to just go there because I was in so much pain and I needed relief, and that's what they would give me because there was nothing. Like I was just in pain every single day until this.
I'm sorry, have you been charged?
No, I haven't. When I was on narcotics, I was incredibly suicidal because I couldn't function. Sure, I wasn't in as much pain anymore, but it wasn't a life. It was not a life at all. I spent most of my time in bed. Ever since I've been on medical cannabis, I just feel like my life is completely transformed. I can walk my dog, I can work, I can do all these things now that I wasn't able to do before. And I think that it's wrong that I can't have access to that and that I can go and get as many narcotics as I want. It's wrong. It's twisted.
You're here.
Point 2, legalization and regulation of non-medical cannabis. We have deputations on that, so we'll go on that.
And I think that's so important because it shows that Toronto is actually driving the way for reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. And I think it's up to the city to keep that momentum going.
This is a blanket, Hamilton blanket, and we wanted to view as a public gift. Great help. Thank you so much.
The rule is you have 5 minutes, and I have to be pretty strict on the 5 minutes so that I am fair with everyone. There may be questions after the deputations that the board would be permitted to ask you. Our next issue is the legalization and regulation of non-medical cannabis. Now, we don't have a presentation on this particular item, but I do want to make sure that, and we do have a list of about 8 or so deputants. We are not speaking about medical cannabis. and regulations and enforcement related to medical cannabis. This is a different kind of report, and I know because it's been in the news and enforcement has been in the news that you might think that this is a forum to do that. This is not the forum if you're focusing on the medical use of cannabis. There are a number of recommendations before us here. My hope is that people really focus on the report that is before us, okay, to guide our deliberations on that. So we have a number of deputants. We'll start with Dr. Jürgen Rem, Director, Institute for Mental Health Policy Research at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, followed by Viresh Fernando. Dr. Rem, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me, and I will try to really focus on the 3 recommendations which are in front of us. For the Center of Addiction Mental Health, we welcome this report very much. We had released a policy paper in 2014 where we laid out that legalization with strict regulation is the best way forward, and this report seems to underline this spirit again. Basically, we are in a situation where it becomes clear that in 2017 we will have legalization of cannabis. For a lot of people, this is the end of the debate and the discussion. The truth is that with the legalization, we only have a starting point for actually getting the cannabis question right. And we want to underline that we should do everything to initiate steps to basically regulate cannabis in a way that we minimize health risks of cannabis. Cannabis is a psychoactive substance, and while in our report we've laid out the different arguments for and against legalization and believe that overall we are for legalization, that does not mean that at this point we should not talk about the risks of cannabis and what regulation should do to minimize those risks. So the first recommendation on developing a regulatory framework which uses an evidence public health approach is really what is necessary for cannabis. That includes regulation of access to cannabis. It is not a easy question, and we have to get right those different questions of what we can regulate and how can we control the substance which is actually sold. From alcohol and the history of alcohol, we know that governmental agencies are probably the safest way to regulate cannabis, and that is part of the evidence base which will be discussed within those regulatory frameworks. Overall, Canada needs an approach to cannabis which puts public health first. And that means not only public health in the sense of mitigating against chronic disease, it also means safety and all of the considerations about cannabis and operating machinery, including, of course, driving and traffic. The right set of regulations, if we implement it carefully and we evaluate those implementations, is therefore necessary. And that brings me to the third point of the recommendation, which is calling for a monitoring framework. This is absolutely crucial. We need to have baseline measures in the beginning, and we need to see if those regulations, which are partly formulated on our experience with other substances, legal substances and illegal substances, but a lot will be coming from the alcohol field because cannabis in legalization will be one of the first nations to do so. the situation in the states of the US is different, and we cannot use a lot of their experiences. So we will try to give the best evidence to plan the step forward, but we'll have to be open if we get something wrong to actually correct those things and get it right. And we can only do so if we have an ongoing monitoring system. These are all of the reasons why KMH is really welcoming this report and all of its 3 recommendations. We should use a public health lens in developing the regulatory framework for cannabis. We should, of course, earmark funding for research on potential health impacts. That will be absolutely necessary to also convince those who currently are skeptical about the approach, and you've seen some of the deputations. And we should also develop and fund a monitoring framework, because that will enable us to successfully get it right and improve. Even if we have gotten it overall right on the first try, there will be some little screws which we have to finalize. That was my deputation. Thanks a lot.
Great, thank you very much, and thank you for understanding the time restraints. The questions.
Well, the negative consequence of the criminalization approach are threefold. First of all, it did result in the criminalization of a lot of young people, which basically branded them for lifetime. It got a lot of punishment and legal consequences for simply using cannabis, which should not be the case. It was actually one of the most pronounced problems with the criminalization approach. Secondly, it didn't work. While Canada had a criminalization approach and prohibition, it resulted in Canada having the highest rate of cannabis within all of the 196 member states of the World Health Organization.
Didn't act as a deterrent.
It didn't act as a deterrent.
Yep.
And thirdly, it enabled an illicit market and the contact of our school children with this illicit market. So they were actually in contact with people who would also sell other drugs.
Yeah.
And those 3 reasons alone would be enough for abolishing the approach. But at this point, as I try to make sure...
If I could, I just have some other questions.
Yeah, sure.
So you alluded to that, given the failure of the criminalization approach from public health, getting the cannabis question right, as you put it, it requires us to put a public health approach first and foremost from a legalization framework. That's right?
Yes.
Okay. So what are the different types of regulatory items that we need to consider in ensuring we put a public health framework first?
A, we have to control the product. We would not sell milk without control. Why would we sell cannabis without control? Mm-hmm. B, we have to be clear that there will be a market, but we would also not allow minors to participate in this market. C, we have to control the quality of the product and the price. The pricing has to be based on considerations which make it unattractive to be in the illegal market and to be the only product or the main product in town. Thirdly, we have to make very clear that cannabis, as any psychoactive substance, should not be an ordinary commodity. We would not allow a marketing and advertisement as for any other products. And fifthly, we have to get the whole system in a way that the public is educated about the harms, the potential risks, and other considerations about cannabis. Currently, we have a very lamentable problem in that even students of the U of T, non-representative sample, but still quite large sample, most of them believe that cannabis is improving their thriving.
Right.
That makes no sense.
So
Finally, we have to have the...
You've got great lists. I have one final question, though, if that's
Okay.
all right. So I understand, so some of the considerations, content, price, age appropriateness, distribution, education, driving. Do we need to also find the right balance between over-regulating a substance to the point that it furthers an illicit market and not under-regulating a substance such that you normalize behavior, especially amongst young people? Do we have to find a balance around that regulation?
We do have to find a balance, and I see this balance especially with price.
Right.
And that is why we have to deal with pricing in regard to a potentially legal market. Same thing we had to do with illegal alcohol at the time when we reinvented alcohol as part of the civil society after
Now we're
Prohibition.
reinventing cannabis. I got you.
Exactly.
Thank you kindly.
Thank you very much for your thoughtful comments. Other questions? We'll move on to the next deputant, Virish Fernando. Welcome.
Thank you, Councillor Mihevik. My name is Viresh Fernando. I live and work in Thorncliffe Park. My councillor, John Burnside, has just deserted me. I guess he doesn't want to hear what I have to say. But John and I are old friends. I do not own a cannabis store. I am not a user. My preferred poison is alcohol, single malt scotch if anybody wants to give me a gift. So you're probably wondering why am I here. I'm here because of my background. My background is as a constitutional and a human rights lawyer. I practice litigation on a day-to-day basis. And I say that, but I'm really nervous and scared being in front of, in the presence of 200-300 people here. I think that, Councillor Mihevik, there is a real serious misunderstanding that has not been addressed in the media. My friend Jana Valeriani and I tried to address some of these issues in a Globe and Mail op-ed piece we did last Monday. I don't think anybody disagrees that millions of Ontarians use cannabis on a recreational basis. The issue is that right now they're getting it on the street. Mayor Tory has sort of said that we have to do something about the city budget, that we are completely strapped for cash and so on. I totally agree with Mayor Tory, which is an amazing thing because I rarely agree with Mayor Tory. So we should not be using precious resources of the city and from the police budget raiding stores as we did last week. I have estimated that it cost us about $120,000 to carry out those raids last week. Somebody told me this morning that actually it was $430,000. Now I don't know, but I think I would go with 120. Most of us in this room know, there is a system of purchasing cannabis for medical use, which we are not going to need to discuss today. What has happened is that even that system is broken down because there are 11 court rulings that have held that system to be unconstitutional. So in a sense, there is a legal void. We call it a lacuna in terms of the language we use. And so even that system is broken right now. What we have before us is a great opportunity to come up with a system here in Toronto and to be an international leader in terms of putting together a system that's going to work, whether you're buying it pursuant to a prescription, which actually will become obsolete when it's available recreationally, and when it's being sold to recreational users. Now, something really remarkable happened last Friday, and it happened in Edmonton, but it really impacts on us. Premier Wynne was in Edmonton, and she, in response to a question about the raids that were taking place in Toronto at that time, said that she believes that regulation of retail sales ought to be the responsibility of the city, which is amazing because up to that time, Premier Wayne, who by the way is also my MPP because John and I live in the same area in Ward 26, had basically sort of said, you know, it has to be like an LCBO model. But when some of us started pointing out, look, you've taken out beer and wine sales from the LCBO, at least partially demonopolized it, and put it into grocery stores, you really can't call for a complete monopolization of marijuana sales. By the way, what happens is that, I don't know whether any of you remember your civics class, but being a lawyer, under the British North America Act, moment the feds decriminalize or legalize marijuana, it completely falls to the provinces and to the two territories kind of deal. The feds will not do anything about it, just like it is with alcohol, as the previous deputant said. So basically, if Premier Wynne's position has now changed, that it should be your responsibility here as city councillors and as the mayor of the city, then I think that this is a great opportunity, as Councillor Cressy has been saying over and over again on radio, that the city takes a very, very progressive approach. And I would urge the city to take the approach that the mayor took in terms of Uber. The mayor said, wait a minute, we can't say that this technology doesn't exist. We can't, okay, we'll do. And so we need to really go forward. And we have both Vancouver and Victoria as good examples. You know, there has to be distance put between from schools, from places of worship, from stores next to each other, 3 on the Danforth, on the 300 block, crazy. And as long as we take that approach and the public health approach that Dr. McKeown has recommended, and the 7 or 8 issues that were raised very correctly by the previous deputant, I think that the city has a very good opportunity to come up with really wonderful regulations, and I would really recommend the city to do that, to grasp the bull by the horns and to ride it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions? Seeing none, our next speaker is Kevin Hall, Chronic Pain Toronto, followed by Dennis Long, Executive Director of Breakaway Addiction Services. Welcome.
Thank you very much for having me this morning. My name is David George Oldham. I'm here in place of Kevin Hall. I just wanted to start off by recognizing that we are on Anishinaabe Haudenosaunee lands, and thank you very much for discussing this matter today. I fell really into this trade as a grower when I was prescribed medical cannabis by my doctor in treatment of symptoms of multiple sclerosis. Since that time, I've been put into a world where I've been blessed to hear of people fighting stage 4 cancer, arthritis, and numerous chronic health conditions that this last week I saw the city impact those people's lives. I would encourage this council to examine the report that Chronic Pain Toronto had submitted previously in December of 2015, originally commissioned by the city, with regards to the treatment of chronic pain and the pain epidemic in Canada, and where the avenue of medical cannabis fits into that treatment plan. In 2014, when we saw a change to the regulatory framework of the medical marijuana access regulations that provided patients the ability to possess and produce their own cannabis, we saw a change to the program that allowed licensed producers to be the only legal accessible point of cannabis for those patients. That drove up the cost of the actual medication to the point that it wasn't accessible for those patients, and dispensaries have filled the gap for the last 2 years. I was very happy this morning to see the cooperation with the Indigenous community of Toronto, that we seem to be moving forward, and it's really that type of relationship that I'd like to encourage with the patient community of Toronto that I see right now. We're being somewhat put to the wayside, as the recreational use of cannabis is something that needs to be considered. I would find its medical application more prudent. Really, my submissions, if I could keep them brief, I do understand, like I say, that recreational use seems to be the focal point of this report, and I was somewhat surprised to see that, but again, would encourage that for people just hoping to have more days holding their children without pain. Myself, I love just walking through the park with my dogs, and it's cannabis that's keeping me that's allowing me, to maintain that quality of life. And I appreciate the growers and processors who have put themselves in risk for the last 15 years to allow me to maintain that quality of life, and would hope that the fine members of this council could begin to work with those parties alongside other members of this trade to provide the solutions that patients like myself need.
Great, thank you very much for your presentation, Kevin. Any questions? Seeing none, Dennis Long, Executive Director, Breakaway Addiction Services.
Good afternoon.
Afternoon.
Good to be here again.
Good to see you again.
Thank you. I'm the Executive Director of Breakaway Addiction Services. We've been treating young people from the ages of 12 to 25 with drug-related problems for the past 27 years. I'm also a professor of addictions and mental health at Humber College and Guelph Humber University, just to sort of flesh it out, and a member of the Drug Strategy Implementation Panel. I'm a strong supporter of legalization of recreational use of marijuana. And I'm a strong supporter of this report because I think what it does is take a very clear-eyed, realistic look at how we have to go about developing some way of rationally incorporating this substance into our society. If we don't do this, we're going to screw it up, to be honest. But I think the other thing is, as I was driving here today to make this presentation, I was listening to CBC phone-in on exactly this issue. And it struck me the gap between reality and public perceptions of this substance. And it is vast. And we are enmeshed in a lot of myth and misrepresentation about this substance. People don't really know anything about marijuana, despite the fact that it's been around in popular use now for 4 or 5 decades. We really do need to have regulations that reflect current realities, current research knowledge, and we need to build a basis for increasing that research knowledge, which is woefully inadequate. And the reason it's woefully inadequate is we've criminalized this stuff for the past 100 years and nobody's studied it. So we really have to have that in place in order to do this. And when I say myths and misrepresentation, I think we need to get to drill down to what's the real truth here. The other thing that I've seen as a clinician is that a lot of people have, well, there's a certain sense of moral panic coming out. Okay, we're going to legalize recreational use. Oh my God, our kids. Well, what I've seen in the past 27 years is that pretty much any kid in high school in this city can find marijuana within minutes any given day. It's there. It's real. It is something that kids have been living with now for 20, 30 years. We have to really accept that. And what we're doing here is beginning to look at a new page, a different way of approaching this, which will get kids out of the underground network where they've been used to get stuff, and adults for that matter, and possibly reduce the illegal trade in a substance which currently, with the exception, of course, of medical marijuana, everybody has to access in order to get the drug. The regulations, as I said, have to establish norms for behavior, and they're not going to be easy. They're going to be complicated and difficult to do. I hate to say this, but I really do need to say it would be really useful if the federal government would provide us a little bit of guidance in the interim right now, because they announced a few months ago, okay, we're going to legalize this, and it doesn't look like going to get around to it in any real sense for a year, and meanwhile, we've got nothing. And I think that every, municipalities and other regional governments are saying, well, what do we do? I think there needs to be some real firm guidance from the feds in order to, well, this is what you should do in the interim. We have to avoid a moral panic. We have to avoid going down the old road of the evil drug and how do we control it. We need to be clear, and we need evidence-based approach to developing regulation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dennis. Are there any questions? Yes, Councillor Doucette has a question for you.
Thank you very much for coming here today. I must say I have learned more about cannabis, marijuana in the last few weeks than I have in my entire 50-something years I've been on this planet. I grew up on a very small island as well, so. So if and when the federal government does legalize, the report we've got before us today, would you agree that because we're looking at this even with an evidence-based approach, it should, this is going to sound strange coming from me, improve the product in the way that it would be purer and not so many of these horrendous things I'm hearing are added into it and then sold on the street?
Well, again, that goes back to the issue of the mythology. Yeah, there are some substances on the street which were adulterated. It's not that common, to be quite honest. And I guess that's the other kind of danger thing that we have to really get to the thing. Yeah, quality control is important. You know, if you go to one of my favorite stores, the LCBO, and buy stuff, you know, there's all kinds of people who regulate that, the production of that substance. I know if I go and buy X, it tells me right on the bottle what I'm getting and what the potential. That's where we have to get to with this substance. Albeit now it's an organic substance, it grows, but we can do that. And I think that's what would give consumers more confidence. And you know, if you go into a store and somebody said, well, there's this much THC, then there's this much THC. Some people don't want so much, some people may want more, so you'll be able to make that choice. Yes, I think that's absolutely true.
And you're also touching on about the federal government has left everyone just hanging in this grey area, so to speak. Would you agree it's been quite difficult for municipalities to come up with rules and regulations, because we could come up with something now and all our businesses would go out and accommodate what we're telling them to do, and then the federal government could come in and go, oh, no, you know, you can be 200 meters and we're saying 300 meters. So you agree that it's really
I think it's a mess, hanging. To be quite honest. I think, you know, I mean, this kind of, I understand to a certain extent political realities. You can't just sort of do it overnight. But on the other hand, it is really unfair to local legislators and rule makers to say, okay, in a year, this will be legal. If I was a police officer and somebody, well, you know, am I going to go bust this guy for something that will, in a year, not be a charge? How do you do that? And I think there needs to be some kind of guidance here to avoid the kind of Wild West, you know, because if I was somebody who wanted to establish a business in distributing marijuana, I would be moving now to establish my bona fides and try to build a market, because that would make sense, rather than waiting until the writ drops or, you know, whatever, the bill passes and I can then move with my business plan. I'm going to be starting out. So there needs to be some rules and regulations and guidelines for me to follow to go about that.
My last quick question. The recommendations you've seen in this report, is there anything you would want to add to what we're wanting to look at when the government moves forward? Actually, no. I mean, the things that I found encouraging in the report is that it really takes the state-of-the-art knowledge that we have. The only thing that bothers me is to look at this and say, well, this is the state-of-the-art, because we don't know the effects of occasional use. We should, but we don't. And there's a number of other kinds of things like that are not well explored. That's disturbing, but that's not a criticism of the report. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Doucette. Councillor Cressy for questions.
Thank you, Dennis. I just want to follow up there. You mentioned the desire that it would be helpful to have some interim federal guidance and measures for municipalities across the country prior to a new federal regulatory framework. But do you think that interim guidance and measures, that they should also take a public health approach as opposed to a criminal approach? Because interim guidance and measures mean many different things.
Yeah, and I think they have to avoid this I hate being critical of the federal government, but, you know, of saying, well, the law's the law, we got to keep following the law. Well, the law, as we've heard in the previous deputations, didn't work. So why should we continue to do something that doesn't work? And I think I'm absolutely on side with you. If we're going to establish interim regulations, which will be refined at a later date, then let's base them on clear research evidence and public health policy and harm reduction approach.
So, for example, if the federal government were to decriminalize possession today, from a public health perspective, is that one approach?
It could be, but again, it would have to be within some kind of regulatory control. So, you know, if you went and said, okay, well, you can possess, you know, you wouldn't want somebody carrying a bale down the street. So what would be an acceptable amount for somebody to possess and so on? Yeah, there's stuff you have to think about.
Thanks, Dennis.
Thank you very much. Our next deputant is Derek Moran, or Moran. Welcome, Derek.
I just want to first start off by saying that I acknowledge and accept the subscribed oath that you all took to be trustees of mine pursuant to Section 4 of the Public Officers Act. So I read through the report and Appendix A from the Medical Officer of Health. The part that stuck out at me was the federal law that provides designated psychoactive substances in Canada is the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act. Ironically, that act actually has an enacting clause at the beginning of it, whereas the City of Toronto Act does not. I just want to point that out. So this report seems somewhat incomplete to me. And my question to myself was when I read this, what about the rest of us that don't work for the government that want to use non-medicinal cannabis? So I'll just elaborate on that. I met Mayor Tory at Joe Oliver's Canada Day picnic a couple of years ago, and I asked him, do you actually know what the law is? And then I said, do you know what the default jurisdiction of law is? And he said, well, I would say that whatever it says in the Constitution. So if you go on the Federal Department of Justice's website, they have a whole bunch of stuff explaining the Constitution. There's something here called bijuralism. Canada is a bijural country. That means that it has both common and civil law systems. Matters of private law in Quebec are governed by the civil law, while the common law applies in the other provinces. Federal bills and regulations must respect both types of systems, and the legal concepts within these laws must be expressed in both English and French. This is directly expressed in the Constitution with Section 52.1, which states the Constitution of Canada is the supreme law of Canada, and any law that is inconsistent with the provisions of the Constitution is, to the extent of the inconsistency, of no force or effect. And then the application of the Charter is Section 32.1, which reads like a whole bunch of gibberish. Like, if you read it, anyone I've directed to read it and then tell me what you think about it, they get back to me and they say, I can't make heads or tails of it. So instead of reading the logical structure of Section 32.1, as Professor Peter Hogg explains in his Constitutional Law of Canada text, as cited in Eldridge versus British Columbia, Attorney General, 1997, Supreme Court of Canada, I'll just read what they summarized about it in Prigden versus University of Calgary, 2010, and R versus Whatcott, 2014, as they both cite the Supreme Court of Canada in RWDSU versus Dolphin Delivery, 1986. Professor Hogg's clarification that Section 32.1 has been interpreted to mean that the Charter only applies to government actors, government action, and not to private activity. In a nutshell, what I've just told you is Section 32.1 of the Constitution says that acts and statutes only apply to government employees. So when you speak in terms of legal, in terms of non-medicinal cannabis use, what you're really saying is that legal it means, oh, it's okay for government employees to use cannabis, and illegal means that it's not okay for government employees to use it. What about the rest of us, though? I don't care about legal. I don't care about legal, illegal, it doesn't matter to me. Why? Because Canada is a common law jurisdiction. Nowhere in the report does it even mention that. So like in the future, if you hear Mayor Tory or Bill Blair say, oh, the law is the law, the question that should be asked is, which law are you talking about? Which jurisdiction of law are you talking about? Because as of right now, as it stands, I wouldn't do this to go antagonize them, but I could go out in front of police headquarters and light up a joint, and they might try and attorn me to their foreign jurisdiction of law, which is Admiralty Maritime, that they act under. If you actually read the definition of Canada, it's not what people think. But these people, when you arrest one of these people for what happened the other day, the definition of person in the criminal code is actually Her Majesty and an organization. The first time Councillor Greb ever saw me at her budget town hall meeting last year, she did not go, you know what? That guy looks just like Her Majesty in an organization. Everything that happened the other day was basically false, 361, false pretenses, false arrests, because these are living men and living women. These are lives in being. That jurisdiction doesn't apply to them. They don't work for the government. I know it's a lot of cognitive dissonance for people to take into, especially for government, when they hear this for the first time. But again, acts and statutes only, yep, you gave the lawyer almost an extra minute though. Acts and statutes only apply to government employees, basically.
Thank you very much. Appreciate your comments. Appreciate you staying to time as well. I really do. Any questions? Seeing none, we'll move to Christopher Cardozo.
You guys understand though what I just said, right? Right? No, I don't want you guys brushing this off. This is important.
Yes,
You're dealing with your fellow men and fellow women's lives.
Yes, we understand. And if you do have a written submission that will help clarify a lot of that, we're also welcome to receiving that.
You're more than welcome.
Thank you. Christopher Cardozo.
Hi.
Welcome.
Thank you. My name is Christopher Cardozo. I'm co-owner of THC, Toronto Holistic Cannabinoids, second store in the city that was an open door policy. We served only prescription-only patients, yet we were still rated along with everyone else. First and foremost, I just want to go on record and state that it's absurd that there's a council meeting on the licensing and regulation of non-medical marijuana when the meeting for licensing and regulation of medical marijuana was deferred. When you prescribe medical marijuana, especially for patients who have cancer and immune deficiencies, seizures, Health Canada has an extra responsibility to look into these chemicals and what they're putting in the product, into the plant. Large corporations, the LPs, they have large facilities. They're closed to the public, and so we can't ascertain the exact processes in which the marijuana is produced, and if there are any additives or chemicals added to it. As a dispensary who only purchases from licensed growers, licensed by Health Canada for a long time under the MMAR program, these production processes are easier to check and verify because we go directly to the grower themselves. They're small grow sites. If there is an issue, it's easily rectified and fixed, much quicker than on a large scale one. As for regulation, on the Health Canada website itself, there are outlined guidelines for compliance and enforcement, but they're very vague. Patients would be unaware of how often routine inspections are, and how long before the issue is rectified, leaving them vulnerable in the interim. I do recognize that this could be an issue for licensed growers also, which just shows there needs to be regulation of medical marijuana before it goes recreational. The silver lining here is the smaller grow operations, as I stated earlier, it would be easier to rectify and take care of these issues, and the patients are closer to the answers. It should be noted that patients that tend to opt for medical marijuana desire to opt for more natural medicine. Therefore, chemicals and additives need to be disclosed, and their legal precedents upholding the right to choose, especially since the current situation in our country is failing us. Basically, the dispensaries provide a service that the LPs aren't able to do, which is a face-to-face, in-person service, able to educate and explain and show how these plants are grown, shown what's going into them, goes with the marijuana plants themselves, edibles, derivatives, all sorts. It's easier to check and verify these things. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions? Seeing none, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Lisa Campbell, followed by Tanya Longo. Lisa Campbell. Welcome, Lisa.
Hi, thank you. So I'm here today representing the Cannabis Friendly Business Association as well as Women Grow Toronto, which is a network of women entrepreneurs who are involved in cannabis locally. Today we're applauding the Toronto Board of Health for moving forward to endorse legalization. Personally, I've served on the Toronto Drug Strategy for many years as a youth representative, so it's a really important day for me to be sitting here today and that we all agree that no one deserves to be criminally charged for cannabis. I think that's very important and powerful. Last year, the City of Vancouver moved to regulate dispensaries, and during these deputations, the Chief Medical Officer of Health, Dr. Patricia Daly, stated that there's no difference between the harms of medical and recreational cannabis dispensaries. Other cities currently are licensing these small cannabis businesses, but the City of Toronto is launching raids. Instead of wasting these taxpayer dollars with unjustified raids, we could be working together to come up with sensible drug policy. Recently, the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives released a report stating that there's a loophole that allows vices to be taxed municipally. For years, the Toronto Drug Strategy Implementation Panel has struggled to fund its efforts, including community-based harm reduction programs, which have traditionally been excluded from federal funding. This is a huge opportunity to to fund this work, including harm reduction, just as the Beautiful City campaign generates $10 million of annual tax revenue from billboards for youth arts programming. So personally, I was really involved in that initiative. It was a youth-driven initiative. We worked with Councillor Mihevik to drive this forward and generate revenue for youth programs. Personally, I'd love to see the City of Toronto work with the drug strategy to come up with standards where we can actually generate revenue from these small cannabis businesses, license them, and use that funding for drug education for young people, for harm reduction programs, and other community services. Right now, it's ironic that the Toronto Board of Health has put forward this report as it's just days after the raids, which were the largest cannabis raids in Canadian history. Instead of punishing dispensaries, the city should be working together with us to craft regulatory framework, which includes small businesses, not just big corporations. The Supreme Court has already declared that Canadians have the right to access cannabis in all its forms for medical purposes. There's no reason to punish local cannabis businesses while the federal government licenses huge corporations. Thanks for your time.
Great, thank you very much. Appreciate your comments, Lisa. Are there any questions? Okay, seeing none. Thank you very much, Lisa. Tanya Longo, Brady Zerborg, Queens of Cannabis. Welcome.
Hi, I'm Tanya, and this is my partner, Brandy. We're actually here as patients today. The costs of enforcing illegal marijuana are outrageous. 22,400 individuals have been arrested since March of 2016. It's a waste of taxpayer dollars and resources. We need to start using these resources for abuse cases and rape and terrorism. What happened here in Toronto on Thursday was completely unnecessary and used as a show of force. Why do the arrests continue on the verge of legalization? Marijuana is not a lethal drug. It's unfair and unconstitutional to treat marijuana users more harshly than alcohol or tobacco users. The way edibles were attacked and portrayed during the Toronto Police Services press conference showed their lack of knowledge and education on cannabis use. We all know that the worst thing that will happen if you eat a medicated cookie is that you'll feel similar effects to that of a strong painkiller, and you might have an amazing nap. Yeah. We're not going to die from eating a medicated cookie.
So I'm Brandy Zerberg, here as a patient today as well. I agree with regulations. I've never come out. I actually called in the media for regulations to be able to protect the patients in the current market. Going forward for recreational users, This needs to be addressed as well, but it is not near the degree that you guys think it is at. It's unbelievable, the raids. Like, wow, cannabis and patients and cops and battering rams, it's pretty far stretch. So let me tell you a little something about regulation that needs to happen is we just need to know how much THC content is in our edibles. That's the only issue. And as Tanya just stated, you know, the worst thing that will happen is that you'll have the best sleep of your life. So I think those arrests, you know, I hope you guys feel ashamed about it. It's pretty terrible.
It's just up to the city to stop the arrests. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Great, thank you. Thank you for your presentation. Noting, of course, that we really aren't here talking about the arrest and what happened Thursday. We're public health.
Yeah.
Our job is
realize
just to
that.
look at the longer term, so I gave you a little bit of leeway.
Yeah, except for you guys wouldn't listen. You wouldn't listen to us at the time of the issues. We were given 72 hours and then kicked out. So
You
what
guys
did you
here is
expect for
public
today?
health. You guys
Public
here
health.
is
Well,
public health?
city.
This is that's not really before us yet.
No.
Okay, but
Thank you.
I gave you some leeway to make your point. Great, thank you. We have next is Constantino Betsis, then Matias Marin, and the last speaker is Adolfo Gonzalez.
Good afternoon, respected members of the Board of Health. I am a 47-year-old retired professional who is a medical marijuana patient. However, I am not here with my 75-year-old mom and my service dog to talk about the medical aspect of your considerations. Although I do significantly echo the remarks made by Chris, it is offensive to me that I have been brushed aside as a medical patient so that the City of Toronto can begin to determine how many dollars are going to come from the eggs that they have counted. Enough is enough. You had a 25-page report that was buried as a reference in today's agenda items. Those 25 pages were reviewed by a blind man over the course of 5 days and have 82 pages of notes with them. The City of Toronto has made it clear in their report that they did not take care to examine all of their facts. In fact, more than 30% of the facts in the report are completely inaccurate, and as a Toronto citizen, I'm ashamed that the City of Toronto has proposed some of the "we're the second city in the world." We have data and scientific information. This report was written well after Justice Phelan's clear decision that medical marijuana patients must be put ahead of all other issues. Interestingly enough, again with the report, the City of Toronto seems to lean on the very evidence Justice Phelan mocked and clearly stated was not only inaccurate, but offensive. The bias from the very witnesses from the federal government's perspective was so clear that it was laughed at. We sit here with an opportunity to try and ensure that we do the right thing. We sit here with an opportunity to be able to open up two-way discussion that is new and fresh. I am not naive enough to think that all of these dispensaries are real. They're not. A good proportion of them are nothing short of criminal enterprises. Compassion? It is 50 cents to $1.50, $2 tops, unless you're one of the political cronies that's got an LP. How does a dispensary or a compassion club have the audacity to tell me that God's vagina is $530 for an ounce? That's affordable? Seriously, the City of Toronto has to take action, and that action must and will include citizens, not just of the city, but of Canada. I was not consulted, and based on everything I've seen, the only people that were consulted by this Board of Health either paid for it through lunches or made sure that they presented themselves as the end-all, be-all, de facto rulers of what our medical and our recreational system will look like. Congratulations to the LPs for being out there and making their profits. But we, as medical patients and as citizens, will be heard. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Matthias Marin.
I'm Matthias Marin, and thanks for giving me some time to speak. So I read the entire report, and thank you to the Board of Health for producing this report. I'm not sure that I agree with everything in it, but I'm glad that this is at least a starting point. I'll introduce myself by saying, in full disclosure, I am a medicinal cannabis user. I have epilepsy. I went through many, many years of hundreds of seizures a year. That's grand mal, which led to me not going to post-secondary and having extreme difficulty keeping a job because employers fired me since I couldn't make it to work sometimes. Finally, eventually, I did take a chance with cannabis oil, and it helped me a lot. It's negated the majority of my seizures. I'm now healthier than I've ever been since I developed epilepsy. So I have a couple of recommendations I wanted to make that are absent in this report. First, I'm going to give you context on what makes me bring these recommendations forward. So like I said, my most positive experience with marijuana is my reduction in seizures. So great that I live what I would say is quite a normal life for someone who experiences seizures. But I've had many, many negative experiences as well. I grew up in Regent Park and the Esplanade. Both, as most people know here, are very diverse communities, and both have probably a disproportionate, like several other areas in the city, number of affected people by the criminalization of marijuana. My brother is schizophrenic. Had he been given good information over the years from those who were giving him information, such as his teachers, the government, the mainstream media, which all of you mainstream media who are here should be ashamed of yourselves for constantly disseminating incorrect information. Because of this, my brother was using marijuana heavily and was afraid to come to us when he began to have issues regarding psychosis. This developed further to the point where he had to go to the hospital, and he was subsequently hospitalized many times at St. Michael's in a mental health ward. Now he's better, but had he known the real consequences of marijuana use and not the reefer madness that was thrust upon us in Catholic school, and I'm sure public school as well, he may have been more informed and may not have used cannabis to the degree he did, knowing our genetic predisposition to mental health issues. I also have a brother-in-law who has MS, and because of the stigma associated with marijuana and his late father being a doctor, he refuses to try to use cannabis, even though his multiple sclerosis has effectively ended his life. He no longer works as a teacher, he stays at home all day, he can't drive, nothing. So the community that I lived in, as a white male, it was very evident to me that I was lucky because of the color of my skin. There was a disproportionate amount of enforcement on those who are of minority communities within my community, and that continues now. I am very dismayed by the fact that this report does not include provisions as to looking at the long-term consequences of legalization on these marginalized communities. Many of these people who currently deal in the black market will have to move to other areas of the criminal market to continue making an income. This will, of course, happen in other areas in the city, but these are the areas most disproportionately affected and most disproportionately policed in a negative fashion. So I would definitely recommend that we look into that. We look into the ways to mitigate the long-term effects of legalization on these communities and how we can economically stimulate them, socially stimulate them, and begin to repair the broken bonds that exist within our communities. I have one other recommendation, and that is that the Board of Health go about creating a campaign of information and not disinformation. For years, our youth have been very, very poorly informed, adults as well, as to the effects of cannabis. This is what results in bad decisions. I believe it is incumbent upon the Board of Health, considering how many other areas where they talk about public health education, to support a development of a public policy structure in which we begin to educate our youth and adults about the true risks and benefits of cannabis. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much for your time, Matthias. Much appreciated. Are there any questions? Quick question, Councillor Cressy.
Yeah. Matthias, I just want to follow up. You were speaking about the impact on individuals, which is both it will be a social health and economic impact.
Absolutely.
Displaced from working in the current market, currently illicit market.
Yes.
What are some of the measures you would see that as part of a regulatory framework we should consider to support individuals, both, as you put, people who are marginalized and working from a low income point of view, but also others who are working in a market right now?
I would say, number one, for the marginalized communities, if we are going to tax this the way I expect we tax the majority of other things in this country, we need to appropriate funds from that and direct it to doing social, economic, and public health development within these communities. As for those other people within the market that are more fortunate to not be as policed as the others, I believe just having fair access to regulations where, like we said, it's not a crony capitalism sort of situation, and where small businesses and big businesses are allowed to flourish together, I think that would be very ideal. But I do really think that it's important to take the risks, benefits, and the moralizing has to stop, and the disinformation has to stop. And watching the media interview a variety of people today outside of this room, the media continues to perpetrate misinformation, and they ask bad questions. Thank you, Councillor Cressy.
Thank you. Last deputant is Adolfo Gonzalez.
Thank you, Council, for having me. I'm here, my name is Adolfo Gonzalez. I'm here speaking on behalf of the Toronto Dispensary Coalition. I'm going to try to not go over a lot of the same points that were brought up by the people speaking before me and try to fill in the gaps a little bit. So I think it's important for the Council to consider why the city of Victoria and Vancouver chose to create regulations that were adherent specifically to medical cannabis dispensaries and not recreational dispensaries. The reason for this is because, as you know, municipalities have the right to regulate land use, okay? When the federal government comes around of making these decisions, what they will do for you guys is give you this wall, and then you will have to fill in the guts. Okay, so this work will be necessary work regardless. Initializing these processes are processes that will need to be had when the announcement comes. It can start before the announcement comes, right? So I think it's very crucial that we look to those municipalities that have already started enacting these kind of protocols and ask ourselves, well, why didn't they choose to come out with recreational regulations? And the reason for that being is that medical regulations are going to be the highest standard of regulations that you can come up with, okay? So think about how first you're going to take care of the people that are exposed to having the most fundamental right, almost as a Canadian, respected, okay, which is the right to choose your ailment and the right to choose your treatment and the right to be treated with dignity in the transcourse of finding this. Okay, so basically we need to think that those level of regulations are the kinds of regulations that you guys are going to want to develop. Why? Because those regulations with such a high stature and such high demand will adapt perfectly well to the recreational market. So basically what I'm saying is you're killing two birds with one stone and you're creating the right regulations from square one by focusing on medical. And this is why Vancouver and Victoria have chosen to go this way. So it's important that the City of Toronto realizes that they're not fighting this fight alone. Municipalities elsewhere in the country have spent a lot of money and time and effort in talking to people like myself that have been involved in this industry for 15 years. We know the reality on the ground. We've been helping patients for a long period of time, much before the federal government even came up with regulations that dealt with these problems. We also need to keep in mind that the reason why these laws were changed to begin with was not because LPs were out there doing lobbying. From before 2001, dispensary patients, dispensary growers, and dispensaries themselves have been putting their lives on the line, their money on the line, and paying for the court cases that have brought us to this place in the first place, okay? So when the media and the federal system wants to paint dispensaries as being here to make a quick buck, paints us as people that don't care about the law, we care more about the law than anybody else involved in this situation, obviously. We've been putting our lives, our families at stake for a long time. So we wish for you guys to be aware of this, to pay heed to the reality of the history behind how we got here, and to look to other municipalities. Why have they chosen to tackle medical first? Because if you go for a recreational standpoint, your regs are not going to be something to look up to. Toronto is not going to deal with the issue in the most progressive manner. So I want you guys just to hear my words, pay heed to them, and please, the City of Toronto needs to utilize any influence that they have on the police force to drop those charges when these people get to their court proceedings. In effect, we need to deal with this in a progressive manner, and that is the most unprogressive move that the City of Toronto could have done. So this is basically what I have to say for you today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate your comments, Adolfo. Are there any questions? I have a quick question.
Please.
So I'm going to ask the medical officer of health this. As I understand it, basically the federal government, their role, just in terms of the division of legal labor, the federal government's role will be to say yay or nay to decriminalization, yay or nay to legalization. They end there. Then the province will have a role in saying, okay, this will be the distribution mechanism. It will be through dispensaries. It will be through LCBO. It will be through new government agency, whatever.
Exactly, yes.
Then it will be up to the city to say, okay, there will have to be a distancing, land use planning kinds of issues.
Precisely.
Do you agree with that?
I do agree with that.
And so the question then, well, no, I won't ask it. I won't ask it. I'll ask it offline because I really don't want to get into the dispensary issue in this public health forum. But I'll ask it to you outside, perhaps.
I can't get you to reconsider. I'm sure I can respond.
It's okay. It's okay.
Okay.
Thank you. I appreciate your comments.
Thank you for hearing me.
Okay, thank you. That brings us to the end of the deputation. So we'll now invite questions of staff. Questions of staff. Councillor Cressy.
Thanks. So to the medical officer of health, it's a question I posed to the representative from CAMH, but to you and your report, what are the harms associated with the criminalization approach that has been in place for the last century that from a public health perspective you think need to be mitigated?
Those harms are not laid out in any detail in this report because that wasn't the position that we took. But broadly speaking, I would agree with the description of harms that was outlined by the deputant.
Which are?
Well, really unnecessary criminalization of individual behavior, a failure to address the harms arising from the substance itself, in other words, availability to youth and so forth. And I think, generally speaking, an inappropriate use of resources.
So a legal regulatory approach that we've talked about in the report would mitigate and remove those harms of criminalization?
Yes, it would.
Okay. Now, in the report you spoke about some of the harms associated with the recreational, non-medical use of cannabis that you'd be looking to mitigate through a framework. What are some of those harms? I understand that one of the recommendations is for a great deal more research. One of the deputants spoke about the lack of research for occasional use. But from what we know and the evidence you've presented and seen, what are some of the harms we're seeking to mitigate? You refer to cannabis being, in a recreational context, not a benign substance, I believe were your words.
That's correct. No, the evidence that we do have, and acknowledging that there are many areas where more evidence would be helpful, probably the most significant public health finding actually has to do with the interaction between cannabis use and driving. So that's listed in the report. There is also evidence of negative impacts on pregnancy, negative impacts on respiratory health, particularly with heavy or chronic use. There is a small risk of dependence. There are links between particularly heavy and chronic use and mental health outcomes, both in terms of developmental as well as mental illness.
Okay. So would it be fair to say that a regulated legal framework would remove the harms of criminalization while mitigating some of the harms associated with the non-medical use?
Yes, a public health approach to regulation would seek to minimize the harms associated with the use of a legal substance, similar to the approaches which have been taken with varying degrees of success with alcohol and tobacco.
So as the city's medical officer of health, our top doctor, is it your opinion that a legal regulatory approach is the best policy for cannabis?
Yes, a public health-oriented legal regulatory approach.
All right. Now, are there any negative health impacts then if the current criminal approach towards non-medical cannabis continues for another year? If we've identified and you've said that there are harms associated with criminalization, and we recognize that we can mitigate those harms through a public health approach, are there not negative health impacts if we continue with a federal criminal approach for another year?
I'm just reacting to the 1 year time frame because I think these are complex transitions. But in general, yeah, if I would take the view that a public health approach is going to be more effective at mitigating the harms that we know are associated with the use of what is the most commonly used currently, illegal drug. The longer we delay putting that in place, the longer we forego the improvement in harm reduction.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Other questions? I have a couple of questions related to a question that I asked the deputant, and that is the division of legal labor here. The way I'm viewing it, and finding your report, of course, very helpful in that regard, and comparing it to other debates that we have had, and maybe not picking on the smoking one, but picking on the pesticide one. The way I understand it is the feds decide that a product is legal or illegal. They go through their due processes. The province then will decide on the distribution mechanism, and then our role will be to decide on how old, or unless the feds or the province decides that piece. Ours will be to decide how it's used in the community context. Can you perhaps speak to that? Do I have it right, and maybe you can elaborate on it as well?
Well, there are areas of jurisdiction which differ between for purposes of this debate, 3 levels of government. So, for example, you're correct that land use planning is generally implemented at the local level, although the province does set a framework for that. There seem to me in this area to be exceptions. So, for example, when it comes to the topic which is not on the agenda today, medical cannabis, the federal government has chosen to reach down and regulate quite specifically in terms of how it's distributed, how it's produced. So I think there is some variation in terms of legal jurisdiction, but broadly speaking, you're right, the different levels of government have different roles.
So one of the pieces that we might be helpful at with our City Hall is to identify that you might be thinking of these kinds of things, which your report does, when we consider, say, land use planning.
Yes, the aspects of regulation which the report has recommended to mitigate harm, some of those are clearly in the local municipal arena.
This report is not endorsing the legalization of cannabis. Is that your position as the medical officer of health?
Well, that's correct. The report makes recommendations for implementation, given that the federal government has already signaled its policy direction towards legalization and regulation.
But we are not, through this, endorsing the legalization. Not that we're not endorsing the legalization. We are mute on that point.
It's not included in the recommendations, it's fair to say.
And we have not, certainly, I've been on the board a few times.
To my knowledge, we have not actually taken a position on the legalization, have we? Or the decriminalization piece.
Way back.
Have we?
Way back. Yes, thank you. I was just looking for the date. The board's decision history on this is cited in the report, and I was looking for how far back it was. It's been some time since the board spoke out on this.
And our position today on that big issue is decriminalization is where we're at. Is that fair? Just looking for the reference here.
The report focuses on, in the context of a federal policy direction for legalization and regulation, how can we best do that in order to minimize public health harm? That's really the focus of the report.
Okay, thank you. Other questions? Trustee Glover.
Okay. Yes, I was really intrigued with the Deputant Matthias and what he brought up in terms of one of the impacts of this will be that people who are currently selling drugs illegally will lose their source of income. Are the people do we have any research or do we know if the people who are currently selling drugs illegally are disproportionately in low-income communities in the city?
Probably depends on where they are in the illegal market, whether they experience a low income or not. But no, I think that it probably, and this is not the subject of the report, but I would assume that people who are disadvantaged in a variety of different ways, including by a low income, are overrepresented in a variety of illegal activities, often because that's the only option open to them.
Right, and so I am concerned about the impact that would have. I read a while ago when California was having a referendum on legalizing marijuana that they calculated the cost savings at $4 billion in terms of savings to police and enforcement and jail time, and also the money that would be generated through taxation. So it seems like there will be, I don't know what it'll be across Canada or in Toronto, but there seems like there will be savings and the opportunity to generate some revenue. Is there a history or is there a record of that kind of money going towards supporting communities that are going to lose a source of income or supporting low-income communities? Or is there, I guess I'm having a little trouble phrasing my question, but is there a way that we could recommend, that the Board of Health could recommend, that some of that money be directed to support low-income communities, especially those that may lose a source of income?
Well, the short answer, I think, is yes, the board could make such a recommendation. The number of jurisdictions that have actually completed a transition to legalization are relatively few around the world, as the report points out. So I'm not sure that there are any examples. I'm just looking to colleagues to see if there are any working examples where that has been part of the policy framework moving forward. However, it has been a traditional role of governments to provide social and financial supports as well as to foster economic activity and opportunities for people who are disadvantaged. So I don't think it differs from that traditional government role, regardless of whether we're talking about legalization or not.
Right. It's going to leave a bit of a void, I think, if that source of income is lost. So anyways, those are my questions. I'll leave that for now. Thank you.
You may want to turn around, and if there's a motion percolating, Susan's right behind you, just so you know. Okay, are there any other questions? Councillor Doucette?
Just to clarify, why did this report come forward? This hasn't been requested of you in the last few months since the federal government has said this. Why did this report come forward to us now? And why were we looking at the non-medical cannabis in this report and not medical cannabis?
Well, the report was requested in 2015 following the issue having been raised by the Drug Strategy Implementation Panel. That was prior to the election of the federal government and the change in policy at the federal level, and it was also, of course, prior to recent enforcement activities. So this report really came from a very different context than we have today. Having said that, I believe the recommendations in it are still appropriate and relevant for the coming change at the federal level.
Thank you very much.
Great, okay, thank you. Speakers, Councillor Cressy, Chair of the Drug Strategy.
Thank you. I'm going to start with moving a motion. If it can be put on the screen, it's being advance circulated. This comes from the Toronto Drug Strategy Implementation Panel. that the Board of Health urged the Government of Canada to provide immediate interim guidance on how municipalities should approach the possession and sale of non-medical cannabis using a public health approach prior to the forthcoming legalization and regulation in 2017. I want to thank staff for their hard work in preparing this report and building on Councillor Doucette's questions there. To those in the audience who are wondering, the reason this report is here today is because we requested it more than a year ago, that we proactively as a board said what are the type of regulatory frameworks from a public health approach that we should consider with cannabis. That's why this is here and that's why it's thorough, is because we as a board proactively took steps on this more than a year ago. These days, everybody is talking about pot. The Prime Minister is talking about pending legalization. Of course, people who ingest, vape, smoke, use pot are talking about it. The Mayor's talking about it. The Chief's talking about it. We're all talking about it. We need a fundamental shift in discourse away from a failed criminal approach towards a public health approach. That's what we need to do. A legal regulatory framework is needed. And I'll be very clear, as I always am, I fully support the legalization of pot. The challenge now is to get it right and to make sure we do that. The war on drugs has failed. It doesn't act as a deterrent, we know that. $1.2 billion is spent annually to enforce the law. It has a negative impact on individuals, families, and communities. In fact, 500,000 Canadians, 500,000 Canadians, are carrying a criminal record for the offense of possession. And far too often, it disproportionately affects marginalized communities. Criminalization does not work. Now, cannabis, as we know, has important medical benefits, really important medical benefits. Everybody should have the right to medicinal marijuana if they need it. Everybody. And in fact, as the courts have said, and we all know, that needs to be improved. That access needs to be improved. But what we're dealing with here today, as it relates to non-medicinal cannabis, recreational, is that we also have to understand in designing a public health-based regulatory approach that there are also harmful consequences of recreational use if it's not used properly. And in fact, a lot more research is needed into this. So it's not benign. So like tobacco, we need to look at the respiratory impacts. For young people, we need to understand better what the cognitive impact is. Certainly for driving. These are not benign impacts. That's why we need good regulatory frameworks. Now, a public health approach, as we've heard, has a number of important considerations. And here we are as a Board of Health debating what are those types of approaches that we think the federal government needs to consider as it relates to distribution, access, content, age appropriateness, pricing, marketing, driving, and public education of the risks. We need to do this thoughtfully. Drug use is complex. Drug policy, therefore, also must be complex. We need to get the balance right. If you over-regulate, you continue an illicit market without the same quality control. If you under-regulate, well, then you normalize a behavior which we know has consequences. So you need to get the balance right. But where we stand today, and I want to be very clear, in our motion from the Toronto Drug Strategy Implementation Panel speaks to this, is that despite the really positive indications that we're going to have an evidence-based public health approach to pot in 2017, as it stands today, the federal government today has let us down. We have been told by the federal government that criminalization doesn't work, so tomorrow we're going to solve it. But today, you have to continue to enforce it. That doesn't work. The approach needs to be adjusted, and municipalities need guidance today. This isn't Toronto on its own. Municipalities right across the country are struggling with a vacuum. We're in legislative limbo. And we cannot have a public health scenario where some municipalities are implementing bylaws, some municipalities are cracking down on possession, some municipalities are doing nothing. That's not a good public health approach. If public health is the overarching framework, then an interim guidance and interim measures based on public health are required. It's time to move to a legal regulatory framework. It's time for the Board of Health to state clearly that a public health approach is the way to do it, and the task now is to get it right. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Cressy. Other speakers? I know Stacey has a motion. I'll let Stacey go, and then Councillor Doucette.
Okay, good afternoon. My motion is pretty simple. It's just an amendment to recommendation 4 to also forward this report to the provincial and federal ministries of transportation. And Councillor Cressy did indicate that there is a key public health concern as it relates to drivers. In terms of the use of cannabis while they're driving. Although the report does indicate that there's some inconsistencies with the effects of cannabis while driving and it's still not well understood, it is important that we keep the federal and provincial ministries of transportation updated with this report so that this key public health concern of driver safety can be addressed.
Thank you very much. Very helpful motion. Councillor Doucette to speak.
Thank you very much. I did want to ask, as I asked the question about when and why this report is here today, I don't know if everyone did read that first paragraph in the report. I wanted people to be clear about when we around this table started thinking about this. So now that the federal government has said sometime in maybe the spring of 2017, you're correct. We as a municipality have to get our ducks in a line, so to speak. But as a Board of Health, we have to look at this from a health aspect. As I said earlier, I have learned so much in the last few weeks and months, and I appreciate people who have spoken to me. I know we're not talking about medical marijuana today, but I think that, and the federal government has to look at that part. I do believe it helps people. I do believe it has medicinal reasons and things. I do believe that. But what we're talking about today is how to regulate to help on the health side of a recreational use. I support the report in front of us because these are the sort of outlines, the guidelines we've taken when we're looking at tobacco, when we're looking at alcohol. So I don't think we're looking at this in any different way. I truly hope we do have an age limit because a lot of young people don't understand that smoking cannabis does have health impacts on them. We've gone through this in Board of Health when they're smoking the hookahs. They say, oh, it's safe, it's safe. It's not 100% safe. Smoking pot isn't 100% safe. So people who are going to smoke it have to be educated and have to understand what they're doing to themselves and also what they're doing to those around them with a secondhand smoke. So this is why this is suggestions to the federal government. I hope they listen to us. The Toronto Board of Health does guide the way in so many different areas. We've mentioned, the chair mentioned some today. So I do support this. I think we do need some restrictions. I think one of the important things to me is to make sure the product out on the street is safe as can be, that everyone understands what they're doing to their bodies by using it, whether it's smoking, ingesting, rubbing, all the different forms there are. One other thing I would like, and I know it's not quite here today, and I am probably overstepping my mark, the government, both governments, the province and the federal government, have to also work with our doctors so they know how to do a proper prescription when they're doing medical marijuana. That's not before us today, so I'll stop on that. So as I say, I do support this. It is a step forward. I think we do have to tell the federal government what they should be doing. I think they have left us all hanging in a very, very grey area. And I think they should move their little derrieres and get this going as quickly as they can. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Doucette. Seeing that Trustee Glover is still kind of working on it, maybe I'll speak, or do you want to go? Yeah, and then I'll give you a few more minutes. Great, thank you. I want to thank staff for this report. It is so well written. And you know, I have an eye for bias. I try to have an eye for bias in reading these kinds of reports, and I found it to be so thoughtful, and it did not bring any moralisms to it. It did not bring any assumptions that at least I could perceive. So I really thank you, Susan, for. Julie, you're a good writer, and this is testament to that. And another thing that certainly I found in reading it is in the scan of literature. It is good. I found I learned a lot. I did not know that smoking marijuana, smoking cannabis has a different impact on how you drive than alcohol. And, these are the nuances of this conversation that are really going to be important when the final regulations that we will have control of as City Hall are going to be put into place. So I think, and I think our appeals, when they start to do hearings at the federal and perhaps the provincial level on the issue, that we're going to have a good basis to be making strong recommendations as a health unit. So I think this kind of science-based, scan of literature-based, best practices-based approach that we're applying here is going to serve all of us well. I do think we are, as Councillor Cressy mentioned, in a paradigm shift. We are moving from, call it a punitive criminal justice mode of understanding cannabis to a public health mode. That's a cultural transition. That's a deep cultural transition. We've gone through that transition before. We went through it with the temperance movement just slightly less than 100 years ago today to a more public health approach that we use now. And so we're doing that with this particular product. And it's going to take a little bit of getting used to, and we are in that limbo period. We are in that in-between paradigm period. And yes, some might think the police acted too strongly. Some may think that that's the law is the law of the law, and they have to apply the law as they see it. Well, that's really, thankfully, that's an interregnum period. We will get this right. And yes, we have to suffer through some things in this period while we're working it out. But I think it's good for us to see that really what we're about in terms of larger social processes is this paradigm shift from one way of viewing it to another way. And we think we're going to have a healthier community once we move to another way of looking at it. And I hope, even with the conflicts that we have now, that we keep our eye on the ball. The ball is really going to start to roll out rather quickly as 2017 comes along. What I view this report as is the beginning of the conversation on the how. How is cannabis going to be distributed? How are we going to make sure that the product is a product that isn't laced with inappropriate substances? How do we approach education? How do we approach driving and cannabis use? How do we approach age limitations? All of those are going to be very, very serious questions. We've got to get all those questions right as legislators on at all three orders of government. And so this is the beginning of the conversation, and really, to me, the test is, does this start a good conversation? I think it does. I think it does. I think this report gives us some good idea on the kinds of issues that we need to struggle with in the days and in the months ahead. From the deputation, I can't remember the gentleman who made the point, we need to start educating folks. And so I do have a motion that urges the staff to begin that broader education process as soon as possible so that we have a broad base of knowledge, real knowledge in the community that will serve a conversation. So I think it was Matthias who made that recommendation. Okay, so those are my comments, and now Trustee Glover.
I'd like to echo the comments about the report. I thought it was incredibly easy to read and well organized, and it gave us a very quick but comprehensive overview of the issues. Based on the comments, and I think it does speak to the value of deputations, this committee has discussed many times the poverty as a key determinant of health. And I think that, one of the unintended consequences here is that we will be depriving some people of a source of income. So I've drafted up this motion, and I thank staff for helping me put it together very quickly, but it basically says that the Board of Health urge the Federal Minister of Health to earmark some of the savings and tax revenue generated from the legalization of cannabis towards low-income communities, particularly those affected by the unintended consequences of legalization. Earlier, I quoted the $4 billion that was calculated in California. California has roughly the same population as Canada. I don't think our savings will be $4 billion because we haven't had a rather ill-advised war on drugs, so we don't have nearly the incarceration rate. But I think there will be some savings and some money, and it would be great if at least a portion of that was earmarked to those communities.
Great. Hey, thank you. Anybody else? Thank you. Great conversation. So we'll go through the motions. Thank you very much, Nancy, for putting them in such a good order. The first motion is by Councillor Cressy. You have it before you. All in favor? Recorded vote. Okay. Trustee Glover, Councillor Carmichael Greb, Stacey Berry, Councillor Doucette, Councillor Mahevik, Councillor Cressy, Councillor Nziata, and Peter Wong. All in favor? That passes unanimously. Number 2, that recommendation 4 be amended to also forward the report to the provincial and federal ministries of transportation. Need any recorded vote? Probably not. Okay, all in favor? Opposed, if any? That's carried. Number 3, that the Medical Officer of Health be requested to begin an education campaign. All in favor? Opposed, if any? That's carried. And lastly, not lastly, but the last amendment, that the Board of Health urge the Federal Minister of Health to earmark some of the savings. All in favor? Opposed? That carries in the majority. And now the motion as amended. All in favor? Record this. Peter Wong, Councillor Nziata, Councillor Cressy, Councillor Mahevik, Councillor Doucette, Stacey Berry, Councillor Carmichael Greb, Trustee Glover. In favor, and of course then none opposed. Thank you very much, everyone. This was a good discussion. I thank you for your attention and for your courteousness in making your presentations. Thank you.
The Board of Health has said yes to today?
The Board of Health has proposed to the federal government that it take a public health approach to the legalization and regulation of non-medical cannabis use. The government has said that it wants to legalize and regulate. How they do that will make a difference to the health of the population because, as we know, the use of cannabis is not without harms.
Now, in this interstitial period, where there is no sense as to how the legislation is going to go, can you give a sense of what the public health challenges that you're facing in dealing with marijuana use? It seems like half the population thinks that they should be able to smoke when they want, and half wants the other half in jail.
Well, the uncertainty is a concern, particularly in terms of education. I suspect there's a lot of misunderstanding about the use of cannabis and how safe or unsafe it is. One of the decisions the board made today was to ask us to do some public education in this area. We lay out in the report a number of the health harms that are associated, particularly with heavy and chronic use. They're not insignificant.
Dr. McKeown, does the Board of Health have, is it important that it speaks on this particular issue in light of what happened last week with the raids and this gray zone that's sort of popped up?
Well, the report was requested by the board before recent events, and I think it's an important topic, independent of anything that's happened recently with medical marijuana. There are many more people in Canada who use marijuana recreationally than there are who use it medically. And this report speaks to how that can be done, how the federal government can legalize and regulate in a way which addresses and minimizes the health harms associated with that non-medical use.
In your conversation with Councillor Cressy, Doctor, you were talking about how a century of criminalization of marijuana has led to misappropriation of resources. Do you think the Project Claudia raids perhaps were an example of that?
Well, this report really wasn't about that, but it does speak to the current trend, I would say, in a number of parts in the world to try and move away from a criminalization approach. And once you move away from criminalization, it's important to look at what does that legalization and regulation approach alternative look like. it's not open season, we do need to have regulation which addresses the harms that we know do occur, particularly with heavy use of cannabis recreationally, and in areas like driving while impaired. These are clear health risks that need to be addressed in a regulatory framework.
And can you bottom line it for us? What, in your mind, in your opinion, as a medical officer of health here, what does the City of Toronto really need to do or not do when it comes to recreational marijuana?
Well, at this point, the Board of Health is making policy recommendations for what the federal government should do since it's announced its move towards legalization and regulation. I do anticipate that once that legal framework becomes clear at the federal level, that local municipalities will have to grapple with issues like the use of cannabis in public places, which we do now with both alcohol and tobacco, with land use considerations in terms of where can recreational cannabis be sold. Those are the kinds of things that are within the jurisdiction of municipalities, which will have to be filled in once the federal regulatory picture is clear.
Okay. And does this still need approval by council, what the Board of Health has said yes here to today? I believe it. I believe it. No.
No, the Board of Health makes its own public policy recommendations, and these will be the Board's recommendations to the federal government.
Thank you very much.
Do you know how soon the federal government will get their hands on these recommendations, on this report, and when you may hear a response from them?
It will go to the federal government shortly. The city clerk will transmit the recommendations. I can't speak to how long or whether the federal government will respond.
Is this long overdue in your opinion?
I think that there has been a growing realization that criminalization has not dealt with the health harms associated with the use of cannabis, and Canada is moving in this direction in a way which I think gives us an opportunity to address those harms with the appropriate regulatory framework.
The other motion that passed today was put forward by Joe Cressy that asks for some sort of short-term regulatory framework in advance of 2017 that would give the city and also the police in this city some guidance when it comes to things like dispensaries and people purchasing and consuming marijuana. What's your opinion on that?
Well, the board's recommendation was not about medical use of marijuana in dispensaries, but it was about the uncertainty created by the federal government announcing a move towards legalization and regulation for non-medical cannabis, but not being there yet. I think it's important for us to have that public policy clearly in place at the federal level as early as possible.
Thank you.
Thanks, Doctor.
Thanks, Doctor.
Thank you.
Dr. McKeown, you used the word dependency, I think, during your presentation. Why didn't you use the word addiction?
Well, dependency is a word that is used medically, and if you look at the report, it outlines a risk of dependency as one of the health hazards associated with cannabis. The risk of dependency with cannabis is, of course, somewhat less than it is for some other commonly used legal drugs, such as alcohol and tobacco.
And is there benefits outlined in the report?
The report really isn't about the medical use of cannabis, but it does acknowledge that there are therapeutic benefits and that further research is needed in order to understand them better.
And would you recommend people read the report?
Of course, I would recommend people read the report. I think it's a good summary of the issue, of both the health risks as well as the opportunities to mitigate those risks in a regulatory framework for non-medical marijuana.
Thanks a lot. Could you introduce yourself?
Dr. David McKeown, Medical Officer of Health, the City of Toronto.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, McKeown.
Good to talk with you.